Montana Territory, June 1874, the first time Malcolm Foster saw her. She was face down in the tall summer wheat, her dress torn, her boots scuffed, and her body still as death against the golden stalks. He dropped the feed sack from his shoulder and ran. "Miss," he called, kneeling beside her. Her skin was pale as chalk, sunburned at the edges. He pushed her dark hair back from her face and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse, faint. Alive. He scooped her up in his arms like she weighed nothing at all. His cabin sat a quarter-mile up the ridge, tucked beside a line of pine trees. Thunderheads clustered behind the mountains, and already the wind was picking up. She didn't stir once as he carried her, her head tucked against his chest, her fingers limp. Inside, he laid her down on the cot near the stove and lit the lantern. She was younger than he first thought, maybe 20, maybe less. Her dress was patched, rough homespun, and her hands were blistered like she'd been walking too long without food or water. He dampened a cloth and wiped the dirt from her face. She flinched. A soft sound left her lips. Her eyes blinked open. "Hey now," Malcolm said gently, crouching beside her. "You're safe." Her eyes were green, not sharp, not wild, just lost. Where am I?" she whispered. "My cabin." "I found you in the wheat, half dead." She sat up sharply, panicked, then winced as her breath caught. "Easy." He reached for a tin cup and guided it toward her. "Water first." She took it with shaking hands. "How long?" "Not sure. I was checking the fence line when I saw you." "What's your name?" She hesitated. Then, "Francesca Ellery." "Malcolm Foster." She drank, coughed, drank again. Then she looked down at her hands like she didn't recognize them. "Do you remember how you got out there?" Francesca nodded slowly. "I was walking, got turned around. Thought I could make it to Helena, but I was wrong. That's a long way on foot. I didn't have a choice." Malcolm didn't press. She was scared, thin, and she looked like she had not eaten in days. "I'll fix you something," he said. "You can rest here tonight. No strings." For a moment she looked like she might cry, but she didn't. She just gave a small nod, her fingers curling tightly around the cup. By nightfall, the storm came down in sheets. Francesca sat by the fire, wrapped in a quilt, watching the flames with quiet focus. She had barely spoken since dinner, though she had eaten like she hadn't seen a cooked meal in weeks. Malcolm sat across from her, feeding the fire in silence. "You live here alone?" she asked, her voice low. "I do." "No wife?" "No." She looked at the fire again, then at him. "You should have left me there." "I do not leave people behind," he said simply. Francesca pulled the quilt tighter. "People usually want something when they help. I don't." She studied him. "You do not even know me. I know you were half dead in a field." That was enough. Silence stretched between them. The fire crackled. "I was betrothed to a man in Helena," she said finally. "He promised land and a home, but when I got there he changed his mind, said I was not what he wanted, so I walked." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "You came all that way alone?" She nodded. "My father died last winter. There was no one left, I thought. I thought I could make something for myself." He stood and took a step toward her. Not close enough to frighten her, but close enough that she could see he meant it when he said, "You are not alone anymore." Her breath caught, but she held his gaze. The storm raged through the night, but inside the cabin it was quiet. By morning she stood on the porch, watching the sun rise over the hills. Her dress hung loose and her hair was braided back. Malcolm stepped out beside her, mug in hand. "You plan on heading out today?" She shook her head slowly. "I do not know where to go." "You can stay," he said. "As long as you need." Francesca looked up at him. Her eyes were tired, but not as hollow as yesterday. "I would like that," she said. He nodded once. "Then stay." And she did. The days grew longer. Francesca helped in the garden, learned to milk the goats, washed linens in the creek. She was quiet, steady, and when she smiled, it was soft and real. Malcolm found himself watching her more than he meant to. He'd never had anyone around for long. The land was rough, the work endless, but she fit into the rhythm like she had been born to it. One night she stood by the stove mending a shirt. "You ever think about starting over?" she asked. "I do now," he answered. She looked at him then, really looked, and there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. Not fear, not doubt, hope. And for the first time in years, Malcolm felt it too. The last frost had long passed, and the hills around Malcolm's land wore a thick green that only came with deep summer. The wheat stood taller now, whispering in the afternoon wind. Francesca moved among the rows with a woven basket on her hip, gathering wild yarrow and harebells for drying. She'd taken to pressing them between pages of an old ledger she'd found in the cupboard, though she never said what for. Malcolm watched from the barn, one hand resting on the stall gate. She had a way of moving now, quiet, deliberate, like she knew the rhythm of the place. No longer a guest, no longer uncertain. That evening she boiled the petals down with lye soap, humming a tune he didn't recognize. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You make that back home?" he asked. "I watched my mother do it every spring. She said if a woman could make her own soap, she'd never be beholden." She sounded like a hard woman. Francesca stirred the pot. She was, but not unkind. He waited, but she didn't offer more. She didn't speak much of her past, unless it slipped out on its own, and he didn't press when it didn't. He liked that about her, how she didn't fill the quiet with half-spoken things. The next morning, he hitched the wagon and loaded it with sacks of grain and a few jars of honey. "I'm heading to Fort Benton," he said. "Supply run, might be gone the night." Francesca stood at the porch rail, her braid damp from the creek. "Do you need help loading?" "I've got it. But if you'd look after the animals, I'd be grateful." She nodded once. "I'll keep things straight." He hesitated before climbing up. "You need anything brought back?" She glanced out toward the hills, thoughtful. "Thread, if they have any blue." By the time he returned the following evening, the wind had shifted. A summer fire had sparked somewhere north, and smoke hung thin in the sky. The air smelled of sap and ash. Francesca met him at the barn with a lantern. "You're late," she said, but her voice held no reproach. There was a downed tree blocking the pass at Geyser Creek. Took some time clearing it. She reached for the reins. "You hungry?" He stepped down, brushing dust from his hat. "Starved." After supper they sat out behind the cabin, the horses cropping grass nearby, the hills cast in lavender light. Malcolm passed her a folded scrap of blue calico. "Best they had." Her fingers brushed his as she took it. "You remembered." "I said I would." She tucked the cloth into her apron, eyes on the horizon. "You ever think about what you'd be if you weren't here?" He leaned back, resting on his elbows. "I don't get much past here." "You've never wanted more." "More what?" Francesca looked down at her hands. "More than chores and fence posts, more than weather and waiting." He didn't answer right away. The wind stirred the grass around them, slow and warm. "I used to think if I stayed busy enough, I wouldn't notice the quiet," he said, "but now I don't mind it." She turned to face him. "Is that because of me?" He met her gaze. "That's because of you." Her breath caught just once. A few days later, Malcolm walked in from the field to find her seated on the floor near the hearth, surrounded by length after length of blue-stitched patchwork. She looked up, sheepish. "I had scraps. Thought I'd try something." He crouched beside her, running a hand over the fabric. "Is this a quilt?" "Will be, maybe, if I don't ruin it." He picked up one square and studied the needlework. "You've got a steady hand." She smiled, not wide, but easy. "I think I want to stay." He froze. "You mean for good?" Francesca nodded. "I'm tired of looking behind me. I want to plant something that lasts." Malcolm reached for her hand. She let him. "I'd like that," he said. They sat there, the fire low, the quilt piled between them. Neither one spoke of what might come next. They didn't need to. The next morning, Francesca hung the wash while Malcolm repaired a broken hinge on the gate. She sang under her breath, something soft and low. He paused, hammer in hand. He hadn't heard her sing before. Not like that. He didn't say anything about it when she came around the corner. Just smiled and handed her the nails. And she stayed close by all day. By late July, the air turned still and dry, and a fine layer of dust clung to everything: boots, windowsills, skin. The creek ran slower, its banks baked hard. Francesca tied her hair in a tighter knot and kept a damp cloth tucked at the nape of her neck. The days stretched long, not for their heat, but for the quiet they carried between them. Not empty quiet, but a kind that deepened. Malcolm had taken to checking the south pasture each morning before sunup, where a few of the younger calves had started slipping through the fence near the ravine. He returned one morning with a streak of blood down his arm and a torn shirt. "You ought to let me stitch that," Francesca said, reaching for the basin. "It'll keep," he said, brushing her off with his free hand. "I didn't say it wouldn't, but if you keep shrugging off help, you'll be full of scars by harvest." He sat on the porch bench without another word. She washed the gash clean, her fingers sure but careful. His skin flinched once under the cold water, but he didn't pull away. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, threading the needle. Whatever you left behind." He didn't answer right away. The sound of wind through pine filled the space between them. "I was a different man back then," he said. "Meaner, didn't know how to be still." She paused, needle poised. "What changed?" He looked at her, eyes steady. "You showed up." She returned her gaze to the wound and began stitching. The thread pulled tight with each motion, neat and even. That night, Francesca brought in the last of the dried herbs and stacked them in the small pantry beside the sacks of barley and salt. Malcolm leaned against the doorframe, watching her movements. "You've made this place something else entirely," he said. She turned, hands still dusty from the shelves. "It was always here. I just filled in the corners." He stepped forward slowly. "You ever think about what comes next?" Her breath caught, shallow but clear. "Sometimes. I've got no fine words," he said, "and not much to offer besides this land and what I've built on it, but I'd give you all of it if you wanted." She didn't move for a moment. Then she crossed the small space between them and laid her hand on his chest. "I don't want fine words," she said. "I want what's honest." He reached up and wrapped his hand around hers, firm and warm. "Then stay, not just for a season, for good." Her eyes held his. "I was already yours." They didn't speak much after that. There wasn't a need. He kissed her, slow and certain, like he was planting something that would never be uprooted. The following morning, she tied a strip of blue calico around her braid. He noticed it while he sharpened the scythe, but didn't say a word. He didn't need to. When they went down to the creek to wash linens, she walked beside him barefoot, her feet calloused and strong against the path. He reached for her hand once, and she let him hold it the whole way. She'd begun mending the second quilt by then, piecing it together from bits of old flannel and worn shirts. She worked on it in the evenings, humming under her breath as the sun slid behind the hills. Malcolm sat nearby, whittling a wooden ladle for the kitchen. Neither one filled the dusk with talk. The silence between them had changed shape. It was not the silence of strangers or of waiting. It was the kind that felt like home. One evening, as the first of the goldenrod bloomed by the fence line, Francesca rested her head on his shoulder. "You ever think we're allowed this?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he kissed her temple, slow and sure. "We earned it," he said, and she closed her eyes, resting against him as the last light faded, the breeze warm and full of promise. The August sun crept slow and amber over the ridgeline, burning off the last of the morning haze. Francesca stood barefoot in the dew-wet grass, sleeves rolled above her elbows, lifting a pail of water from the well. Her back ached from an awkward night's sleep, but she welcomed the ache. It meant the day had work in it. Malcolm came down from the north field with the saddle still slung under his arm, sweat darkening his collar. He set the leather on the fence, wiping his brow with the crook of his wrist. "Fence posts held through the night," he said, not quite surprised. She glanced over. "You doubted my knots." "I doubted the wind more than you." Francesca grinned without showing teeth and poured the water into the trough. "I checked the coop. 3 hens brooding and the big red one's gone broody again." "Let her be," he said. "She'll come out of it when she's good and ready." They worked side by side until the sun climbed higher. She carried grain and mended a broken harness strap. He hauled a half-dozen stones up from the creek to shore up the garden's edge. By midday, they sat on the porch steps, chewing dried apple slices and watching the sky shift. She looked at him through narrowed eyes. "When's the last time you saw anyone besides me?" He tilted his head, thinking. "Early spring, maybe." "Traded seed potatoes with the Reeds over near Lone Tree." "That's 4 months back," he shrugged. "I've had good company since." She rested her chin on her knees. "I want to ride out to the canyon ridge next week. There's wild plums up there if they haven't been picked over." Malcolm's brow lifted. "It's near 20 miles and the trail's steep. I can ride. You ever been that far into the hills?" "No, but I can learn." He studied her face a moment, then nodded. "We'll take the sorrel and the dun. Leave before sunup. Camp if we have to." She nodded once, satisfied. That night they packed jerky and beans into a saddlebag, and Francesca tacked a piece of paper beside the door with a charcoal list of what to bring. She added a spool of twine without explanation. Malcolm didn't ask. 2 mornings later they left before the sky turned full blue, the horses picking their way along the narrow ridge trail. Francesca rode ahead, back straight, hands easy on the reins. Malcolm kept behind, watching the way she scanned the trees, alert but calm. They made camp near a narrow bend in the trail, where the stream ran shallow beside a stand of cottonwoods. Francesca gathered fallen limbs and coaxed a fire from flint and steel without a word. Malcolm unsaddled the dun and rubbed down her flanks. As the fire caught, Francesca looked over her shoulder. "Why'd you stay out here all these years?" He sat beside the fire, stretching his legs. "Couldn't stand the noise of town. Or the way people look at you like they already decided what kind of man you are." She tossed a dry twig into the flame. "You ever do anything to earn that kind of judgment?" He didn't flinch. "I did." She waited, but he didn't go on. He pulled a tin cup from the saddlebag and filled it with water, passing it to her. Francesca sipped slowly. "I used to think if I got far enough west, I'd stop feeling hunted. And now, I think maybe peace isn't a place, maybe it's a person." The firelight flickered across her face. He reached out, brushed a curl from her cheek. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I know," she whispered. They didn't speak again that night. When they lay down, it was side by side, her hand tucked in his, steady and quiet beneath the stars. The next morning, they found the plum trees heavy with fruit. Francesca climbed barefoot into the branches and filled her skirt with the ripe ones while Malcolm tied canvas bags below. Their hands stained purple. She laughed once light and quick, and he looked up, startled by the sound. "You planning to preserve all of these?" he asked, adjusting the knot on a brimming sack. "Some." She balanced on a limb, testing its bend. "The rest we'll dry or eat fresh if we're greedy." By dusk they were home, tired but whole, the scent of wild fruit clinging to their clothes. Francesca left the basket on the table and leaned against the doorway, watching him hang the bridles. "You ever think we might have a child someday?" she asked, voice even. He turned slowly. "I think about it more than I say." She didn't smile, but her eyes warmed. "I'd like that. Not now, but when the time feels settled. He crossed to her, hands rough and sure as they touched her waist. I'll build whatever life you want, Francesca. Her hand curled around his collar. Then we'll build it together. And with the dusk softening the world around them, they stood in the doorway of the home they had made, the promise between them quiet, strong, and already rooted deep. The first frost came early that year, dusting the fields in silver and turning the tops of the cottonwoods brittle and gold. Francesca stood on the back step with a wool shawl pulled over her shoulders, her breath fogging the morning air as she eyed the sloped garden beds. The last of the root vegetables would need to be pulled today. She didn't say anything Malcolm knew just by the way she looked at the soil, jaw tight, that she was already planning how to preserve every bit of it. He stepped beside her, a burlap sack in one hand, the other brushing the back of hers. We'll dig them out before the ground hardens, he said. Get them in the root cellar while they're still firm. She nodded, then glanced at the sky. Feels like snow's not far off, could be by month's end. They worked until midday, hands chilled and muddy. Francesca didn't complain, even when her fingers stiffened. She hummed low under her breath, but not any tune Malcolm recognized. When they finished, she crouched beside the cellar door, stacking jars of pickled beans and dried plum slices, each marked with a tied scrap of blue calico. He realized then she'd used every bit of that fabric the same he'd brought back from Fort Benton. She hadn't wasted a thread. That night, Malcolm lit a taper and opened the cedar box beneath their bed. He took out the small velvet pouch he'd kept since his father's passing, untouched until now. Inside was a thin gold ring, simple and unadorned, but sized for a woman's hand. He held it in his palm for a long moment, then closed the pouch and slipped it into his coat pocket. The next morning, he found her in the barn, brushing down the sorrel. Dust danced in the slanted light through the loft slats. She didn't turn when he stepped in. I want to ask you something, he said, voice steady. She set down the brush and faced him, eyes clear. I've never done this before, not properly, but I know what I want. I want you with me, not just through winter or spring, but for every day after. Her face didn't change, not at first. Then a slow breath left her and she stepped forward, her hands sliding into his. I never knew what it felt like to belong somewhere, she said. Until this. He reached into his coat and held out the ring. I want to marry you, Francesca, if you'll have me. She looked down at the ring, then back at him. You already know my answer. They wed on the last Sunday before the snow came. The ceremony was quiet, held beneath the cottonwoods with only the wind and the sky bearing witness. Malcolm wore his best shirt, pressed and stiff from the washboard. Francesca had sewn a new dress from undyed muslin, plain but well-fitted. She'd embroidered a single line of blue at the hem, the same shade as the calico scraps she'd always tucked away. They said their vows with hands clasped, voices firm. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, she didn't cry. She pressed her forehead to his, and they stood like that for a long moment, the world hushed around them. That winter, the snow came thick and early, just as she'd guessed. They spent the coldest days reading aloud by the fire, her voice soft over the crackle of burning wood. Malcolm carved a cradle during the long nights, though she hadn't yet told him she was expecting. He didn't ask. He just knew. She told him in the spring when the crocuses pushed up through the thawed ground. He was splitting fence rails when she came down the hill, hands clasped over her apron and eyes bright with something he hadn't seen before, not just happiness, but trust so deep it settled in her bones. I think we're going to need that cradle sooner than we thought, she said. He set down the hatchet, crossed the yard, and wrapped her in his arms without a word. Their child was born under high summer, with the wheat tall and the bees thick in the clover. A daughter dark-haired like Francesca, quiet as a breath. They named her Clara, after Malcolm's mother, a name neither of them had spoken aloud in years. The cabin grew fuller after that, not just with sound but with rhythm. Francesca wove while Clara slept, her loom set near the window where the light hit best. Malcolm built a new chicken coop, then a smokehouse, then a second room for when Clara grew taller. They didn't speak much about what they came from. There was no need. Some nights, after the baby was fed and the fire low, Francesca would thread her fingers through his, her head resting on his shoulder. "You still glad you didn't leave me in that field?" she'd murmur. He'd turn toward her, touch her cheek with the back of his hand. "I'd live it all again," he'd say, "just to find you one more time." And she'd smile, her eyes already closing, the peace between them as steady as breath. By the second harvest, the land had settled into them as much as they'd settled into it. The fences held. The root cellar stayed full. Clara took her first steps across the porch in bare feet, her arms outstretched like the world was wide open. Francesca watched her from the doorway, her hand resting over her heart, and Malcolm stepped behind her, wrapping his arm around her waist. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were home, they were whole, and they were together. Always.